Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name's Jessica Ward King, also known as the Stigma Crusher. Here on this channel, we deal with issues of mental health and mental illness from my twin perspectives as a person with lived experience of bipolar 2 disorder, as well as a person with experience as a PhD in experimental psychology. If that sounds like your jam, you're in the right place, and welcome. I would highly recommend that you hit that subscribe button, and if you want to know every week when I post, you can hit that notifications bell as well to find out every single week. I also wanted to invite you, if you know someone that might be reached by these issues that we're talking about today and every day, do please share this channel widely. I'd love to reach as many people as possible and crush the stigma as widely as we can. Well, with that, I guess it is time to start crushing stigma for this week. And it's great news because we actually all have mental health. Everyone has it. And so everyone could stand to recognize it and to take care of it and, to do all of those things and to talk about all of those things, because it's kind of like, no one's ever mentioned an arm before. And now suddenly they've like, what? This is a great thing. You know what it does? It can grab stuff and reach for stuff and hold people. It can give a hug. It's amazing. That's kind of what we're getting with mental health these days, is that same kind of experience. They're like, wow, did you know you had this whole time? And sometimes did you know that what happens when you don't have it at some points? So it's been amazing. Now, you guys may have noticed, as long as you've known me, that I very often, almost always, will say mental health and mental illness when I'm trying to talk about mental health concerns, and mental illness. I always use both words, and there's a reason for that. It is because mental health is not synonymous with mental illness. They are not the same thing. They are, in fact, fundamentally different things. So mental illness is actually, there are different schools of thought on this, just as there are with physical medical science, different things that are not widely accepted. But generally speaking, a lot of the Western world goes by kind of Western medicine and believes that mental illness is a pathological or disease state. So it's actually an illness. Only some people will struggle with mental illness, just like only some people will get cancer. Not everybody has kind of some degree of cancer more or less throughout their lives. Not at all. Only some people will have it. Mental illness is the same thing. Self-care is really important to take care of mental health. Mental health is really important to be able to take care of mental illness. So if you have that muscle, so to say, it is a lot easier to be able to treat and recover from mental illness in some cases. So it is something that is related. But mental health, having good mental health doesn't mean you have poor mental illness. They're simply not the same thing. What's happened with mental illness during this pandemic is that we've got everybody talking about mental health and talking about those normal, typical, healthy experiences of grief, of loss, of anxiety, of depression. Not the pathological states of anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder, but those feelings and those experiences that everybody, every human, gets from time to time, has at some points. That's become so normalized. It's almost banalized. It's like someone that is struggling with mental illness and says, this pandemic is really, it's made me so ill. I've had a relapse of my illness and I'm struggling to cope. The next person, not understanding, says, I know we all have mental health. We all have feelings like that sometimes. It's really important to do your self-care and take the time for you. And that way, if you want to chat with a friend or have a cup of coffee, like really do something for you, it really helps. And they're right. It does help mental health. It may contribute to helping mental illness, but it is not going to be the same experience. It's not that shared experience that we're so enjoying right now that's reducing the stigma so much. That's not what's happening here. Someone with mental illness has an illness that has a fundamentally different quality to it than the typical experience of human life. And so what ends up happening is that the person with mental illness kind of gets the side eye and is like, everybody's struggling with the pandemic. What's so special about you? What is wrong with you that you can't bounce back? Look, last summer for us, for example, we spent some time in, our green zone or stage 1 or whatever it was called at the time. And we were able to go out, obviously with all the public health stuff in place, but we were able to go out. We were able to eat at restaurants. We had, a little bit of a period of lifting for some of the folks that were struggling with their mental health. And they say, well, what's wrong with you that you can't bounce back like the rest of us can? I mean, everyone's doing pandemic, whatever, YOLO, do your own thing, do your best you. And so people with mental illness end up getting more stigmatized than they did in the first place. Because another thing is, folks with mental illness might mistake this universal conversation about the human condition as something that they should be experiencing and putting out their ideas into. And then when they get that kind of return, think, I'm ashamed of what I'm going through. I'm afraid of what I'm going through. And that stigma, fear and shame. So we have actually had a situation where with the increase in conversation and decrease in stigma about mental health, mental illness is actually having a decline. So I'm one of those people having that experience of mental illness during the pandemic, pretty much a year now, pretty much exactly right on the year. I'm having a relapse of the depressive phase of my bipolar 2 disorder. And I have some of these experiences as well that I've been able to reflect on, given my knowledge, but they haven't felt good either. And so the question, what is so special about you, me, us? What is wrong with us? Wrong? An illness. That is what is wrong with us. What is so special about us is that this COVID that everyone's experiencing is a trigger for mental illness. And it leads to the pathological process. So the COVID in and of itself can't make you ill, so to say. It's a trigger that can lead to brain pathways and processes that then become a mental illness. And you may kind of go through what we would conceive of or consider. You would have this experience of COVID and have this decline in mental health. Really what it was all along was a decline in your mental illness. You may be one of those people whose first experience of mental illness is now during the COVID pandemic. It was the trigger for you. It's not the actual necessarily the cause. The cause is a disease state, probably having something to do with your brain, though we're not exactly sure what, and that will come in a later video. But nonetheless, we don't exactly know how it works. What we do know is brains are involved, feelings are involved, cognitions, the way we think is involved, and the way we behave is involved, and it's a disease process. So it's actually not typical functioning of the human body. That's the really big difference. Mental health, typical functioning. Mental illness, not typical functioning. And once the disease is triggered, the course of your illness can be variable. So it doesn't look the same for everybody who has mental illness. You may be triggered and have an acute experience. So you have a circumscribed period of, intense illness, or it may be chronic. So you may have been triggered by this and it will last for quite some period of time. I'm one of those chronic folks. Having bipolar 2 disorder, it's a chronic relapsing remitting disorder. And so I'm relapsing. It's not that new, but the trigger was COVID. You can have an illness that is responsive to treatment. So kind of like that headache that when you take the Tylenol, it works. Or you can have an illness that is more refractory or more difficult to treat, whether that is, again, medication that you're talking about, or talk therapy, or another one of the more physical therapies like electroconvulsive therapy. Whatever the treatment is, it may not work. It may take time to work. It may be that you have to do polypharmacy, so take more than one medication to get it to work. And that's where the kind of the psychiatric art rather than a science, I like to think of it, comes into it, where it's really can be, if you're refractory, it can be a matter of like, what can we cobble together to get to work? You can have a mild case, which is still awful and sucking. You can have a moderate case. You can have a severe to deadly case. So mental illness can and does kill, through suicide being, kind of the main one. And so there's all these different ways to be sick, whether it's physical illness or mental illness, which, okay, side note, mental illness is physical. I don't know. My brain seems pretty physical to me. But it's the way that we talk about it. And so that's why I subscribe to it. It is the way that we talk about it. It's the way that we understand it so far. And so I'm sure that in 100 years, someone will look back and say, oh, they used to call it mental illness. That's so quaint. But here we are today. So here you are, mid-pandemic. You have been diagnosed with mental illness. The medications are doing whatever they're doing. You may or may not be doing talk therapy. So that's just two of the kinds of treatments that that we really obviously think of for mental illness. Self-care can help, as I mentioned. It's always important to do self-care, keep your mental health on the up and up. It's kind of like if you have a headache, you don't want to also have a runny nose. So you're going to want to keep that health up, so that you're not suffering with both at the same time, at the very least. And particularly if your runny nose then goes on to cause sinusitis, which goes on to cause more of a headache and makes it worse. So you get the point. You can also do physical treatments, like I mentioned. So that could be things like electroconvulsive therapy. In physical health science, you might be thinking about a TENS machine that would help your headache, or cold or hot on the back of your scalp that would help your headache. The kind of last course of treatment that we think of is hospitalization. So folks with mental illness can end up taking time to go inside a hospital and get targeted treatment, where the staff can monitor their progress and adjust the treatment much more quickly if necessary. And oftentimes talk therapy will happen inside a hospital that some people can't afford when they're outside of the hospital. So a lot of great things can happen there. And then sometimes, of course, the brain and the body can fight mental illness off. Some people do not need treatment in order to get better. And that's the case too with physical illness. Some people don't need a Tylenol, don't need the hot and cold on the back of their neck to get rid of their headache. They just get rid of their headache all by themselves. And so either way, the disease process is the same, and the treatments and ways that we can get better from them are the same. Okay, so that's what mental health looks like in the pandemic and what mental illness looks like, with a little bit of a kind of primer on what's this illness thing we're talking about. So what do we do about this? I mean, I've identified a pretty, shocking idea that while mental health and the stigma of mental health have improved during the pandemic, the stigma about mental illness and mental illness itself, incidentally, have not improved. They have gotten worse over the pandemic. What do? The first thing to note is we ride that wave with mental health. So I am not at all advocating for reducing our understanding of mental health, of increasing the stigma again, like absolutely not. That may have kind of led to this devaluation of mental illness, but I don't think it's kind of the thing that needs to be remediated. Not at all. Everybody has mental health, even those of us with mental illness, Everybody needs to keep control of and improve their mental health, especially in times like we are in, where there are lots of things to attack our mental health. And we do need to make sure that people are staying well, being well, doing what they can for themselves, self-care, and to keep this momentum going, that after the pandemic and everybody goes back to normal, whatever that looks like, but that everybody goes back to some semblance of normal of their lives, and everybody goes, oh, thank God I'm done with that self-care and mental health talk. We'll just shelve that, put that on the back burner and pretend it never happened and go on with stigmatizing mental health. No, please, God, I hope not. And you know what? It won't if you and I keep it going and keep on talking about this. The second thing that we can be doing to help against that stigma on mental illness is to advocate, whether it's for ourselves, like I'm doing, or for others, because we all have mental health. We all love somebody with mental illness, all of us. If you think you don't, 1 in 5 people will struggle with their mental illness. And if you've got 5 friends or 5 family members, you know someone. So we can all advocate on behalf of understanding mental illness. So explaining that it's an illness, explaining that pathology, explaining that it's not the normal experience. By definition, that's mental health, that's health, that's the normal experience. It is a disease state, it is an illness. And try to explain to folks what that means, using these things I've discussed, like talking about headaches, or talking, often people will talk about cancer and say, you do have cancer, you don't have cancer. And explaining the difference between mental health and mental illness goes a long way to making people go, oh, huh. It may not solve the problem immediately, but it's a long way to go in destigmatizing it. And then the third, and I think the most important one that we have here, is to support people who have mental illness in our lives. Support them, yes, by donating to charitable foundations, by assisting in community issues and conversations, but really, I mean, helping people who are struggling with mental illness. Because for one thing, it can be really hard to access healthcare, and mental health care particularly, during the pandemic. So all of those appointments where you would have gone and your clinician would have seen how you were behaving and seen how you were how you were talking and how you were acting, they're now either not happening at all. For a period there at the beginning, they just didn't happen at all. And now they're happening over video conference. Like everything else, yes, I know, but it's much more difficult to access, particularly if you're someone that's struggling with anxiety, or if you're struggling with depression, you have, let's say, a dirty home that you're not proud of, you're not well kept, you don't want to be on the video conference, for example. I mean, there could be a billion of examples of this, but it is hard to access. If you have to go into hospital, you're going in there alone, no one's coming to visit you, it's very, very difficult to access. If you want to do talk therapy, now it's through, a screen. It's really hard to do talk therapy. It's really, really, really hard work. It's really harder work when you can't read the body language of the person you are talking to, when you can't see an actual human. It is really, really tough. So it's hard to access. That may mean that you can help someone access it by driving them to an appointment or by helping them set up their video conference. It could be that you help them tidy behind them so that people don't get embarrassed about an unkempt home or whatever the case may be. But even if you're not able to help them to get their appointments, daily tasks can be very difficult when you're struggling with a mental illness. That is taking care of yourself, cleaning yourself. It can take an immense amount of energy just to shower or to brush your hair. You may have so much pain in your body from your mental illness that it's impossible to do those things. You may find that you have such high anxiety and the pandemic isn't helping, that you can't go out and get your groceries. Even the idea of having someone deliver them is, you can't even imagine all the germs on them that have been touched, for example. And so these daily tasks can be really, really daunting for anyone at any point in time, but for a person with mental illness, and particularly during this pandemic. So anything that you can actually physically do is super helpful. Another one is social supports. So people with mental illness, like everyone else, but even more so, need to be with people if they're able. They need to have those social supports, someone who can just be in their presence, someone who can support them. And those social supports are the first thing that went during this pandemic, and they've been the hardest to maintain. Anyone has an experience of, I can't keep my friends close enough because they're all just through a screen. Someone struggling with mental illness who doesn't have the energy, doesn't necessarily have the ability, if they're having social anxiety, for example, to reach out, is really missing out on that social support aspect. And it's so important. That would be my number one. Make sure you reach out in terms of social support to folks that are struggling with mental illness. I'm not going to lie. I've had friends before that I was supporting that it felt like a big weight to support, because someone struggling with mental illness is having an experience that you can't quite relate to, but just, and that is often very heavy, very repetitive. It doesn't just lift. You can't just shake it off one day and the next day be much more cheerful. It really can be repetitive and difficult. That is something you can do to support people with mental illness. Don't leave them. So social supports, absolutely critical. Okay, so Cole's notes of today. Mental health, we all have it. We all go along that continuum throughout our lives, pandemic or no pandemic. People will have high periods, people will have lower periods, and you will kind of slide along that scale. Mental illness, fundamentally different thing. Illness, disease state, not something that you just necessarily can do some self-care and solve for yourself. Now, remember, everyone's experience of their mental health and their mental illness is different. It's unique. And you and I, we are not here to diagnose anybody. We are not here to say, you're just suffering with mental health, if that's not what somebody is trying to express for themselves. So I don't advocate for trying to diagnose one another and trying to decide who is worthy or not of any support. It's just an issue of talking about mental health, destigmatizing mental health, good. Mental illness getting more stigmatized. So we need to act on that. And the best way to think about that is by thinking about whether it is a normal state or a disease state. As I mentioned, best thing you can do, advocate, help out with actual tasks, life tasks that may be difficult for someone with mental illness, and do always be there for a person, be a social support. Get support yourself if you're finding that you're really taxed. This is a perfect time for self-care, but do get support for yourself. Make sure you stay healthy. You can't help anybody else if you are not healthy, and just try to stay together. Be there for one another, and remember that a person with or without mental illness can be a great friend and a great support to you as well. Some of our best interactions are when we're able to share our support between one another. So it doesn't have to be one-sided. Don't worry about that. Okay, everybody. So that's what I wanted to address this time. 1 year into the global pandemic. Please help to destigmatize, to crush the stigma against mental illness. Keep crushing that stigma against mental health by talking about it. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye, guys. Stigma Crusher.